Good evening. Welcome once again to the Frederick S. Pardee Distinguished Lectures. This is the fourth in a six-part lecture series delivered by our visiting professor of future studies, Nobel laureate Dr. Amartya Sen. Dr. Sen's lecture series is entitled The Future of Identity, and tonight's subject is class, gender, and race. These lectures can be viewed as e-lectures on the Pardee Center website, which is www.bu.edu/Pardee. The lectures also will be broadcast on Sundays on the WBUR program World of Ideas. The concluding lectures, the fifth and sixth lectures, are scheduled for the 1st and 2nd of April. For times, look at our website or come by or call us at our phone number here on campus, 358-4000. As usual, after Dr. Sen's lecture, there will be questions, and after that, a reception just outside. Dr. Sen.
Right, well, thanks very much for coming. The title, as Professor Fromkin mentioned, is Class, Gender, and Race, so I'll get on with that. Does not this weather frighten you? James Mill, the utilitarian philosopher, asked David Ricardo, the pioneering economist, in the troubled summer of 1816. I quote from Mill, continue to quote from Mill, "There must now be of necessity a very deficient crop and very high prices, and these with an unexampled scarcity of work will produce a degree of misery, the thought of which makes the flesh creep on one's bones. 1/3 of the people must die. It would be a blessing to take them into the streets and highways and cut their throats as we do with the pigs," unquote. Ricardo was in full sympathy with Mill's conviction that nothing could save the poor, and also with Mill's delicate sentiment that the poor might have to be treated like swine in their own best interest. In a letter to Mill, Ricardo added the complaint that Ricardo was, I quote, "sorry to see a disposition to inflame the minds of the lower orders by persuading them that legislation can afford them any relief," unquote. The correspondence has many interesting features. First, the unquestioning fatalism that characterizes this exchange between two of the leading minds of the 19th century Britain is of considerable interest in itself, if only because fatalism of this kind is in many ways common even today. And yet, famines are almost always entirely avoidable, even after gigantic natural disasters. Sensible public action, including appropriate legislation, can systematically eradicate large-scale starvation altogether. The quote-unquote inflamed minds of the lower orders had figured out something about the nature of the economic world that Ricardo and Mill had missed. I have also discussed elsewhere why fatalism, by generating and sustaining inaction, is itself one of the contributory causes of needless misery in the world. I shall not go further into that issue in this lecture. A second interesting feature of the exchange is the way other human beings are seen by these two pillars of establishment. Mill and Ricardo are not, of course, unsympathetic at all, quite the contrary. Indeed, they're full of sympathy for the poor. But once they're convinced that the poor could not be saved, their natural inclination is to think of putting them out of misery and suffering in the same way as a humane person would treat a suffering animal. Of course, James Mill knew well enough that he could not in fact cut the throats of the poor. But the fact that he regards that to be a kindly way of treating the suffering underdogs of society discloses the distance at which Mill sees these other human beings. They are certainly seen as sentient beings, as animals are too, but they appear to belong to another species altogether. The sense of difference, the feeling, in the context of the title of this lecture, the feeling of non-identity, is indeed a defining characteristic of the divisions and categories that distance our self-perception from the perception of others. I've already had the opportunity to discuss the divisive effects of cultural, religious, and civilizational categorizations when they are taken to be not only profound and momentous, but also uniquely important. While those differences in tradition often operate across the borders of country and nation, and yesterday my talk was all about that, the separation of class, gender, or race frequently work right within the fixed borders of a given country. And dissonance can be a lot more fierce and brutal than James Mill's proactive utilitarian inclination to remove people from misery by obliterating them. When, for example, African American victims were hounded and festively lynched in public squares, or when anti-apartheid protesters of the African National Congress were subjected to brutality and torture, or when opposition activists were gathered in Chilean soccer fields to be summarily shot, or when landless Dalit rebels run the risk of being gunned down by the private armies of upper caste landlords in Bihar, the fabricated distances take the categorical form of unbreachable divisions across which any barbarity, no matter how extreme, is allowed. Indeed, divisions of class, race, gender, and political affiliations provided and continue to provide an implicit foundation for unreasoned distancing of human beings from each other. And we cannot begin to understand the nature of the world in which we live without coming to grips with the reach and implications of these manifest divisions. In this talk, I shall examine the particular relevance of divisions associated with class, race, and gender, along with other social divisions such as caste and community. This is a vast subject, and given the time constraint, I must limit the domain of my inquiry in a somewhat rigid way. Specifically, I want to comment on two particular issues, and at the end I will end with two questions which I won't be answering today, but these are something of the style of the Arabian Nights to make you interested to come for the future. So that's what I will raise two issues which are related to things I'll talk about in April. But the two issues that I want to discuss today are these. First, I want to discuss the varying forms of one of these divisions, varying forms of any of these divisions. I want to particularly point out that any particular division, any of these, gender, class, race, can manifest itself in extraordinarily divergent forms. For example, gender divisions can reveal themselves in many different ways, some present in one region and others more rampant elsewhere. It's important not to take gender inequality as one homogeneous disparity, nor to assume that the absence of one kind of gender divergence would entail the absence of gender bias in other forms. Second, while class, caste, race, and gender can have divisive consequences on their own, their coupling can produce some drastic deprivations. More generally, we must come to grips with the complementarities between these different forms of social divisions. I take up these issues in turn and begin with the first of the two identified questions, in particular, the diversity of forms that any source of disparity can have. Let me illustrate the relevance of variability with gender inequality, though I could have done it for any of the others too. Gender inequality exists in most parts of the world, from Afghanistan to the United States, from Morocco to Japan. But the forms involved can be widely different and also, of course, extremely variable in intensity. Consider the following forms of gender disparity based on empirical studies over the last 2 decades. Here I'm actually following a structure that I pursued in one of the installation lectures I gave in the Radcliffe Institute, and it came out in it's called Many Faces of Gender Inequality. So I'm going to be quite rapid to cover the different types, but if you want to see a fuller discussion of that, you will find that in the New Republic of, I can't think when, late summer, sometime last year. 1, mortality inequality. In many regions in the world, particularly in South and East Asia, West Asia, and North Africa, inequality between women and men may be a matter of life and death, and can take the elementary form of unusually high mortality rates of women compared with what can be biologically expected. This can lead to a preponderance of men in the total population as opposed to the preponderance of women found in societies with little or no gender bias in healthcare or nutrition in particular. I've tried to present estimates of the very large number of women who are quote-unquote missing because of unusually high mortality rates of women compared with what can be biologically expected if symmetric care is received. The total of missing women for China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Iran, etc., can easily add up to 100 million people or so. There have been some controversies on that. I suggested the 100 million number. Ansley Cole suggested 60 million. I think Claassen was 82 million. But they're pretty high, actually, and these numbers are not so easy to differentiate between, given the crudeness of the techniques. 2, natality inequality. Given a preference by boys over girls that many male-dominated societies have, gender inequality can manifest itself in the form of the parents wanting the newborn to be a boy rather than a girl. With the increased availability of modern techniques of gender determination of the fetus, sex-selective abortion has become common in many countries. It is particularly prevalent in East Asia, in China and South Korea in particular, but also in Singapore and Taiwan. And it is beginning to emerge as a statistically significant phenomenon in India and South Asia as well. To deal with this possibility, some years ago, the Indian Parliament banned sex determination of the fetus, except when it is a byproduct of a necessary medical procedure. But it is very hard to press prosecution, especially when the mothers themselves are keen on having boys rather than girls, because you need their evidence to prosecute. Oddly enough, the latest census of India, 2001, reveals the natality discrimination against girls has rapidly become an established pattern in parts of the country. It's very oddity there, in the northern and western states in India, whereas that is typically not the case in the eastern and southern states, where the girl-boy ratio of children still remains similar to that in Europe. Indeed, one of the remarkable things of this division is that every state in the east and west have a higher girl-boy ratio than every state in North and West, and on top of that, nearly every state, with one exception, has a girl-boy ratio which is the same as West Europe or higher in the East and West. So there's a real division of it, and it's not so easy to understand what the roots of it are, and it's not the standard division on the East and on between North and South, on which many people have written. I mean, I know I see Alaka Basu here, and I would quite like to hear her analysis of that. The cultural roots of this divergence and their implications require much closer scrutiny than I believe they have so far received. 3, basic facility inequality. Even when demographic characteristics do not show much or any anti-female bias, there are many other ways in which women can have less than a square deal, including disparities in the basic facilities offered to citizens. Afghanistan under the Taliban may have been the only country in the world in which girls were deliberately excluded from schooling as a part of public policy, combined with other features of brutal gender inequality. But there are many countries in Asia and Africa, and also in Latin America, where girls have far less opportunity of schooling than boys do. There are other deficiencies in basic facilities available to women, including inequality before the law, such as the lower weight attached to the evidence provided by women compared with men, which is prevalent in many countries that draw on a particular reading of the Sharia and the Islamic laws. 4, special opportunity equality. Even when there is relatively little difference in basic facilities, the opportunities of higher education may be far fewer for young women than for young men. Indeed, gender bias in higher education and professional training can be observed even in some of the richest countries in the world, in Europe and North America. 5, professional inequality. In terms of employment as well as promotion in work and occupation, women often face greater handicap than men. A country like Japan may be quite egalitarian in matters of demography or basic facilities, and even to a great extent in higher education, and yet progress to the higher reaches of employment and occupation, the commanding heights, can be much more problematic for women than for men. This type of discrimination is often present without being very clearly identified. In the English television series called Yes, Minister, there is an episode where the minister, full of reforming zeal, is trying to find out from the immovable permanent secretary, Sir Humphrey, how many women are in really senior positions in the British civil service. Sir Humphrey says that it is very difficult to give an exact number, Minister, he says. It would require a lot of investigation. The minister is still insistent and wants to know approximately how many women are there in these senior positions, to which Sir Humphrey finally replies, approximately none. 6, ownership inequality. In many societies, the ownership of property can be extremely unequal. Even basic assets such as homes and land may be asymmetrically shared. The absence of claims to property can not only reduce the voice of women, but also make it harder for women to enter and flourish in commercial, economic, and even some social activities. This type of inequality has existed in most parts of the world, though there are also local variations. For example, even though traditional property rights have favored men in most parts of India, in Kerala there has been a long time matrilineal inheritance for an influential part of the community, namely the Nayars, constituting about a fifth of the population. I quoted yesterday Ibn Battuta, who was born in 1304, traveling around in Mali and Ghana, and his reaction to the free mixing of men and women, and he criticized them. And there's a peculiar reference there, referring to Mali, saying that this is also a place that they have this beastly system in which the inheritance gone down to down the women. And I have not seen this beastly system anywhere other than in the coast of Malabar in India. So it's quite clear that early 14th century it's already well established, and in a sense a comparable feature with Mid-Mali. And in fact, incidentally, in terms of gender ratio, the Kerala ratios in many ways have tended to be very similar, more similar to the sub-Saharan African ratio than North African or the Asian. 7, household inequality. There are often enough basic inequalities in gender relations within the family or the household, which can take many different forms. Even in cases in which there are no overt signs of anti-female bias in, say, survival or son preference or education, or even in promotion to higher executive positions, the family arrangement can be quite unequal in terms of the sharing of the burden of the housework and child care. It is, for example, quite common in many societies to take it for granted that while men will naturally work outside the home, women could do that if and only if they could combine it with the inescapable and unequally shared household duties. This is sometimes called division of labor, though perhaps it's more accurately described as piling of labor. It must also be mentioned that aside from such silent disparities, household inequality can sometimes take the beastly form of violence against women. This is not, of course, confined to the household only, but there is some evidence that brutality, like charity, begins at home. Even though gender identity is central to each of the different forms of disparity involved, they can be present with varying intensity in different parts of the world. For example, mortality inequality or natality inequality or inequality of basic facilities seems to be relatively absent in the United States. And yet there is considerable presence of disparities in special opportunities, such as higher education, or in professional work, such as promotion to the highest level of authority. And oddly enough, frequency of physical violence against women is astonishingly large in this country. Sometimes the same country can move from one type of gender inequality to harboring other forms of that inequity. For example, even as South Korea and China have, to a great extent, reduced the incidence of mortality inequality, the intensity of natality inequality in the form of sex-selective abortion has dramatically risen, making the female-male ratio of children in Korea and China today to have fallen to levels like between 85 to 88 girls per 100 boys in the child category. There's also much evidence that some parts of India, as I mentioned, particularly northern and western states, are moving rapidly in the same direction. And to some extent, just as the mortality inequality is getting reduced, narrowed, and sometimes reversed. The different forms of gender inequality call for rather distinct means and routes of remedial action. It has been widely observed across the world that an empowerment of women through such means as high female literacy and greater opportunities for gainful employment outside the family tend to have the effect of reducing certain types of gender inequality, including mortality inequality and disparities within the household. The reasoning, insofar as it works, is clear enough. If women have greater voice and power in the decisional process, then they can see to it that their deprivations are reduced or eliminated. But this procedure acts to the identity of women, linking them with each other through the bonds of identity. When, however, that identity is not strong or even absent, and indeed when mothers themselves are especially keen to have boys rather than girls, then the empowerment-based remedying of gender inequality may not actually work at all. Indeed, there is evidence that natality inequality in particular is strangely resistant to the standard means of correction through female empowerment. My collaborator Jean Drez and I are just finishing, well, we had finished a book which is going to be published later this month, book on India called India Development and Participation. And we find that if you take some states like, say, Himachal Pradesh, where female education has expanded, you see the mortality differential and childhood has gone down, in fact, disappeared almost. The fertility rates have dramatically fallen, and yet natality inequality has sharply risen. Similarly, in South Korea and China, greater female literacy and outside employment have gone hand in hand with a sharp intensification of sex-selective abortion based on using the new techniques of fetal gender determination. There is, in fact, no good reason to abandon, I believe, the important understanding that women's empowerment through enhancing the voice and influence of women does help to reduce gender inequality of many different kinds. But when women themselves are active in promoting gender inequality through a strong gender preference in the masculinist direction, in preferring males over females to be born, even when they do not discriminate against girls in care or in nutrition once born, then female empowerment cannot on its own cure the consequent gender inequality in natality. There's a need here to go beyond the empowerment and agency of women and focus on women's critical assessment of received prejudices of the society. When anti-female bias in action, such as sex-specific abortion, reflects the hold of traditional masculinist values from which mothers themselves are not immune, what is needed is not just freedom of action, but also freedom of thought in women's ability and willingness to question received habits of thought. Reflective and critical agency may be particularly important in combating forms of gender inequality that operate through women's own agency and reflect an uncritical acceptance of traditionalist values and masculinist forms of identity which have been imposed in that society on the women as well. It is important not only to see the power and reach of gender inequality in general, but also take explicit note of distinct forms of gender inequality and the specific challenges they pose. A similar remark can be made about other sources of social division, such as race, class, or caste, each of which can manifest itself in many diverse forms with varying implications on self-perception and on identity, and different demands correspondingly for different types of remedial action. I turn now to the second issue, to wit, the interrelation between different types and sources of social disparity, the interrelation between. In a previous lecture, I've discussed how the competing loyalties of different categorization can often work against each other and reduce the sharpness of conflict that would otherwise be strongly associated with some unique or preeminent line of crusading division. In that sense, the fact that we are not only different, but also diversely different in many distinct ways can, as I've tried to argue in previous lectures, make the world a less violent place. For example, the fact, this was one of the critiques of the civilizational categories in the Clash of Civilization, arguing that the real problem, in fact, begins before the thesis of clash comes. It's the classification of people by one preeminent idea, namely civilization, which is primarily, as it turned out on analysis, religion, has the effect of exacerbating the divisive tendencies, and indeed, insofar as that perception is strong, and it is, as it is in some of the movements, like fundamentalist movement, then of course it drowns all other competing loyalties. On the other hand, when there are diverse loyalties, it can have strangely quietening effect. For example, the fact that the concentration, and this is a subject on which has not been written, I think, much, the fact that the concentration of the so-called anti-globalization protesters, that, as you know, is between the rich and the poor, between the privileged and the underprivileged, since that concentration divides the world differently from religious or so-called civilizational classifications, can in many contexts serve as a peaceful influence in a world troubled by religious hostility. And yet there are other cases, and that's what I'm going to discuss today, in which the different divisions, rather than restraining one another, can add to the force of each other through the coupling of distinct divisions. This can be an important consideration in the divisions related to gender or race or class or caste. The issue I should emphasize to make a methodological point is not only one of cumulativeness or additivity of different influences, as opposed to any tendency for them to neutralize each other. That's a problem too. That's the first thing. Instead of neutralizing, they add, they accumulate. But it goes beyond that. The distinct influences can sometimes feed each other and play a complementary role in exaggerating the impact of each other and the conflicts associated with each of them. Let me illustrate again from the Indian experience. Sometimes the social analysts have asked in India, is caste more influential than class? Or is class more significant than gender? And so on. The implicit presumption in this line of inquiry is to take the distinct roles of the different divisions as merely supplementary to each other. There is class, and then there is also gender, and furthermore caste, and so on. And we can ask, with some presumption of what economists call separability, how important each is relative to others. However, these different sources of vulnerability are not only each on their own significant roots of deprivation, they can also strengthen the impact of each other because of their powerful complementarity and coupling. Class in particular had a very special role in the establishment and reach of social inequality, and it can make the influence of other sources of disparity, such as gender inequality, very much sharper. The intellectual gain in broadening our comprehension of other types of inequality other than class, which used to be the focus in many traditional left-wing studies, but the broadening of the focus, which is a very good thing, but it has to be followed, I would argue, with a more integrated understanding of the functioning of class in alliance with other causes of injustice. Or to put it differently, class is not only important on its own, it can also magnify the impact of other contributors to inequity, enlarging the penalties imposed by them. The integration of class in a consolidated understanding of injustice is, I believe, of paramount importance, given the need to address simultaneously different sources of inequality that we see in the world, related respectively to class, gender, community, caste, etc. For example, class cannot be seen as the only source of social and economic inequality, and yet each of the other sources of disparity operate in some ways in tandem with class. Consider gender. As I mentioned, many countries in Asia and North Africa have a terrible record in gender inequality. The manifestation of gender inequality can take various forms of mortality inequality, natality inequality, basic facility inequality, household inequality, and so on. And yet, at the same time, women from the upper classes are often more prominent in many of these countries than elsewhere. For example, in South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, all the four major countries in the region, have all had or currently have women prime ministers, something that the United States, along with France, Italy, Germany, or Japan, has never had and does not poised to have in the near future, if I'm any judge. In fact, in contrast, in Bangladesh, where both the prime minister as well as the leader of the opposition are women, and all the leadership seems to be in that direction, it's hard to see when Bangladesh might ever see again a man prime minister. Belonging to a privileged class can help women to overcome barriers that women from less thriving classes cannot come anywhere near crossing. Gender is certainly an additional contributor to social inequality, but it does not act independently of class. Indeed, a congruence of class deprivation and gender discrimination can blight the lives of poorer women very severely indeed. It is the interactive presence of these two features of deprivation, being low class and being female, that can massively impoverish the lot of women from the less privileged groups. Similarly, turning to caste, even though being lower caste is undoubtedly a separate cause of disparity, and the attempts to see caste as nothing other than class, which was tried in some writings, is, I think, mistaken. Nevertheless, its impact is all the greater when the lower caste families also happen to be very poor. The blighting of the lives of Dalits are the name for the groups which were called untouchables earlier, and when they were removed from, when that was banned, at the end of untouchability was the practice of untouchability, and indeed various types of caste practices were made illegal after independence. They were also renamed. They were called scheduled caste, and Dalits is a more common name now used. Scheduled caste is not a particularly descriptive name, and Dalits is a more natural name for the same groups. But we are talking about what would have been earlier called untouchables. The blighting of the lives of Dalits or people from other disadvantaged castes or disadvantaged tribes is particularly severe when the caste adversities are further magnified by abject penury. Even the violence associated with caste-related conflict tends to involve a great deal more than just caste. For example, the Ranveer Sena in Bihar is a private army that draws its sustenance from the privileged Bhumihar and Rajput castes, and the victims of brutality are standardly Dalits. And yet the predicament of the potential victims cannot be adequately grasped without taking note of their poverty and landlessness, and without placing the conflicts often related to land ownership and the bonding of labor, in which upper-class landlords want to re-establish their dominance. Without taking note of that, we cannot get to grips with the problem. The social and the economic background have to be integrated together. Ranveer Sena is not only an army of caste warriors, it is also an army of class-based crusaders. This recognition does not suggest that caste is unimportant. Absolutely not, quite the contrary. But it does make it necessary to place caste-related violence in a broader context in which class inter alia belongs. The basic issue is complementarity and interrelation, rather than the independent functioning of different disparities that work in seclusion, like ships passing at night. Given the wide reach and generic relevance of class related to poverty and wealth, ownership and indigence, work and employment, and so on, it's not surprising that it tends to rear its ugly head in a great many conflicts that have other identifications and many other correlates. In fact, there's also considerable evidence that the curative action, the affirmative action in favor of lower castes have tended to do much more for the economically less trained members of those castes than for those who are weighed down by the combined burden of extreme poverty and lowness of caste. India, it's not often recognized, was in fact the first country in the world to introduce, more than 50 years ago, just after independence, legally instituted affirmative action in its constitution. It was introduced as a transitional measure to facilitate equity. It took the form of reserving privileged positions to the lower caste, to the scheduled caste untouchable group. For example, being in the powered ranks of civil service, for which there is competitive recruitment, the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, the social underdogs of community, were given, and still given, a privileged entry form. In effect, the recruitment from these underdog groups, while competitive within its own category, is delinked from the general competition for recruitment until the minimally required number of scheduled castes and scheduled tribe aspirants have in fact been recruited, and then it becomes opened up again. This policy has generated much debate. It's a subject of tremendous controversy in India, and there have certainly been strong critics. But in many ways, it's hard to deny, and I think it's manifest, that the reservation procedure has worked effectively in getting a great many people from underdog categories, social categories, into influential positions in the civil service. And yet the greatest beneficiaries from such affirmative action have been the economically more affluent members of the socially underprivileged caste. It's often assumed that the two exactly are congruent and are much the same, which of course is not the case at all. Indeed, the reserve posts have often gone to members of richer families among the disadvantaged social categories. It's increasingly clear that no policy, I believe, of affirmative action aimed at economic as well as social disparities can be adequately effective without taking account of the class background in addition to the caste categories. I'm not concerned in this lecture here with the ways and means of doing this, nor with the question as to whether affirmative action can take adequate note of economic circumstances, which are more fluid, more hard to determine than social and caste background, which are more firmly established, more manifest, more observable. I'm pointing rather to the need for seeing caste and class simultaneously to achieve the equity objectives with which the Indian Constitution was so clearly concerned and indeed obsessed. The impact of caste, like that of gender, is substantially swayed by class, and if we adopt a one-sided scrutiny, then the program of social equity may to a great extent be undermined by the reality of economic inequality within the same social or caste group. I turn now to community. The same interdependence applies to community and class. I'm now looking at community and class rather than caste and class. Consider, for example, the victims of communal violence when a minority community is targeted by a more numerous or more powerful, numerous or not, group. When communal tensions are rampant, it is of course true that members of a targeted community can have reason for fear even when they come from a prosperous economic background. That's not denied. And yet the raw danger to which targeted communities are exposed gets immensely magnified when the persons involved not only belong to those communities, but also come from poorer and less privileged families. This is illustrated, for example, by the class distribution of victims of Hindu-Muslim riots around the time of the independence, just before, in the 1940s, and the partition of India. The easiest to kill among the members of a targeted community are those of that community who have to go out unprotected for work, who live in slums, and who lead in one way or another a thoroughly vulnerable life. Not surprisingly, they provide the overwhelming proportion of the victims in communal riots. Indeed, my own first exposure to murder at the age of 11 occurred when I encountered a profusely bleeding Muslim daily laborer, Kader Mia, who had been knifed by Hindu assassins just outside our home in Dhaka, which is now the capital of Bangladesh, then of course undivided India. Kader Mia died in the hospital to which my father took him. Almost his last words to me, there was about 10 minutes when I was alone with him trying to get help from inside the house and my father being fed from outside. Almost his last words to me were that he knew he was taking a heavy, dangerous, and silly risk in coming to a largely Hindu region of the city. But he had to do it in the hope of earning a little money from some work. He was on his way to the work when he was knifed. Kader Mia died as a victimized Muslim, but he also died as an unemployed laborer looking desperately for a bit of work and money. In the Hindu-Muslim riots of the 1940s, Hindu thugs killed the unprotected Muslim underdogs, while the Muslim thugs assassinated the impoverished Hindu victims. Even though the community identity of the exterminated preys were quite different, their class identities were often exactly similar. This was in 1944. The riots today are not any different in this respect. The same diagnosis applies to the recent communal violence in India, for example, the anti-Sikh riots that occurred in Delhi following Mrs. Gandhi's assassination by a Sikh bodyguard, the anti-Muslim brutalities that accompanied the terrible days that followed the demolition of the Babri Masjid, and so on. Class is an ever-present feature of communal and sectarian violence. And I should add, this is not in any way specific to India or to the subcontinent. Class is the unspoken component in all community-based violence, in Rwanda, in former Yugoslavia, in Indonesia, or for that matter, in the anti-immigration brutalities in Germany and other countries in Europe, or in the targeting of African Americans in violent racist encounters in the United States. The class dimension of sectarian violence tends to receive inadequate attention even in newspaper accounts because of unifocal reporting that concentrates on divisive communal identity of the victims rather than their uniting class identity. This brings me back to the theme that I was mentioning, that just concentrating on one category, like civilization, in this case community, makes you overlook many dimensions here, because what you're doing is that in the newspaper saying a Muslim was killed, a Hindu was killed, or a Hutu was killed, a Tutsi was killed, a Serb was killed, or an Albanian was killed, you're focusing on one side and overlooking many other categories, and these categories like being exposed, looking for work, having to go out, being good murder victims, as it were, is absolutely central to understanding the nature of this kind of violence. I want to end this lecture with a distinction that, as I said, I cannot pursue today, but which I want to identify as something I will consider in the last two lectures in the series to be given in April. I will, of course, come back to this question that I mentioned, the preeminent, how much harm the preeminent idea of a preeminent identity does, of which I've given many different types of examples when I draw these together. But I want to open up a couple of new issues related to one particular question that I want to outline today without actually discussing them. Oddly enough, they really draw on the works of two of my friends, both, as it happens, at Columbia University, Ned Phelps and Akhil Bilgrami, and they relate to a distinction which I'm just about to discuss briefly. The distinction is between the first person and the third person perspective in identity. I've already made use of this distinction in the 4 lectures I'm just completing. For example, the need for reason and decision as opposed to discovery, quote unquote, as the basis of one's identity is particularly concerned with the first person perspective. How do we see ourselves, not how others see us? In contrast, the victimization of a group related to race, gender, class, or caste is largely a matter of third person perspective in identity and identification. Indeed, third person perspectives on class or race or gender related to one's identification by others can work in very many different ways from first-person perspectives related to a sense of belonging and personal affiliation. The former, that is the third-person perspective, is especially important for public portrayal and depiction of people, and related to it, the operation of group-based discrimination based on race or gender, for example. The third-person understanding is also deeply influenced by the availability of information about the respective groups, and even about what economists tend to call asymmetric information. Even though we may know well enough that a person is a distinct individual, very different from everybody else, in many ways, in many ways, we also tend to think of persons as members preeminently of particular groups. In the external perception, this is not only the foundation of racist, sexist, and other sectarian prejudices, but also frequently the epistemic basis of our views, right or wrong, of what to expect of someone whom we do not know intimately. Ned Phelps, E.S. Phelps, who had discussed this issue in what he called the rational, I've forgotten the title now, the rational basis of race behind racism. The rationalist, now it's very much an economist way of describing rationalist, namely an intelligently argued basis. In fact, the close linkage of that epistemic function with discriminatory practice is one of the reasons why racism or sexism or other types of sectarianism may not immediately appear to us to be utterly absurd. Indeed, when a group is at disadvantage in terms of, say, education, a community that is known to be underprivileged in terms of education, the identity of a person seen just as a member of that group, which may be the only immediately visible characteristic of that person, can lead to a reasoned evaluation based on subjective expectation, Bayesian expectation, that may be both morally repellent and yet contingently rational. The inseparable linkage of epistemic role of classification with its nasty and unacceptable discriminatory consequence is, I believe, a subject of great analytical as well as practical interest. The evil of racism, somebody asked me yesterday, how do I define evil? No, not I, but how does George Bush define evil? I failed in that, but I gave some idea as to how I define evil, not without bringing in much of religion and faith. The evil of racism or sexism can be inadvertently, but very effectively watered by the rational epistemology of group-based information and asymmetric availability of information. Indeed, we cannot begin to understand the need, when it exists, for affirmative action properly without coming to grips with this odd interconnection. I think this has been missed in much of the attack that's gone on in affirmative action. There has been a tendency to assume that this is just a question of privileging people because you belong to group, rather than counteracting a epistemological discrimination that arises from asymmetric information. That's the issue that I'll have to discuss, not today, but in the fifth lecture. In the fifth lecture, I will argue that the case for affirmative action in one form or another relates very closely to the existence of this kind of informational asymmetry. I should also briefly identify another general issue related to the first, related to the distinction between the first and third person perspective. The first person perspective is central to one's self-definition and to an absorptive sense of identity rather than to one being publicly depicted in one way or another. Even though they're quite distinct, they are, and that's the point I'm making now, indeed cannot be entirely independent of each other. In particular, the first-person perspective, while particularly important for self-definition and empathy, can be strongly influenced by third-person depictions and their implications. A person may be inclined to attach not a great deal of importance to say one's race or caste until it emerges that the race or caste to which she belongs is particularly targeted by others. This can make the identity in the first-person perspective reactively important, responding to the third-person perspective that she observes in the society around her and against which she then protests. And this is often the case. It's often the case with Jewish identity, for example, when it may not assert itself except in the sight of anti-Semitism. This is a particularly important concern in the contemporary world, not just in the context of gender or race or class, but also of community and civilization. As Akhil Bilgrami, who is a philosopher, Ned Fels is an economist in Columbia, Akhil Bilgrami is a philosopher in Columbia, as Akhil Bilgrami has argued in a paper called What is a Muslim? This is a collection of papers edited by Tony Appiah and Skip Gates called Identities, published about 5 years ago. As Bilgrami argued, many of the identities that have gathered momentum in recent years, for example, the identity of being a Muslim, or being an Asian, or being colored, have tended to be reactive against more dominant groups and their role in the world, rather than being based on a more self-confident understanding on one's own self as a product of complex history. Bilgrami's point really is to argue that this undermines us. Rather than thinking of ourselves as we are self, we tend to think of ourselves as the other, different from the West, different from Christian, different from this, and so on. And he argues why there is a kind of both epistemic as well as ethical undermining because of this position we take. That interests me, and I'll come to that. The fifth lecture is on ethics of identity. But I'm also interested in the epistemology of it, the fact that this is a strong influence, that you cannot see the issue of identity excepting in this kind of a dialectical form. As a result, one's self-understanding can take, and this is the conclusion of this point, a dependently dialectical form, which raises very, I believe, far-reaching issues of epistemology as well as ethics. Now, these are the issues that will come up inter alia with other things that I have to do. I'm very aware in the last two lectures I have to pull these things together. The fifth lecture is on ethics and identity, and sixth is the future of identity, which is a general series. But what I'm promising to do is to come back to these issues. I've run out of time today, about how the first person and third person difference in the perspective of identity are relevant, both because of the informational asymmetry between the two, as well as because of the reactive dialectical correspondence between the two. But that will be in April. Thank you. Okay, I'll take my questions. Yeah. Thank you. There are roving microphones, actually. I'm going to pour myself some water. Gosh, I've convinced everybody, I see.
You mentioned earlier that you gave a specific example of discrimination, and you said perhaps that it might be rational to discriminate in some cases. At least that's what economic theory sometimes suggests. So then it seems to me that there's some sort of a conflict between morality or ethical behavior and the sort of rationality that economic theory seems to assume. Could you perhaps discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, well, that would be, as I mentioned, that's not what I discussed. I just flagged the problem. I will discuss it in the next lecture. The issue is this, that, suppose a group is known to be disadvantaged in terms of education, social background, etc., and in terms of exam results, etc., it may not be doing well, not because there's any deficiency of that group, but because they happen to be just socially handicapped. Now, a person appears looking exactly like that. I appear looking like others who made it, you hear that half the Indians are illiterate, or at least 1/3 is, and in general, you have a certain perception. Now, when you're looking for a job interview and when you don't know very much about the person, and especially when you're trying to do such rapid informational analysis, Ned Phelps's point is that you have Bayesian good reason, subjective expectation, good reason to know to use what you know about this person, which is on the whole unfavorable, even though it may turn out that this is the budding Einstein in that group. You don't happen to have that information. So the group-based information, since what the person himself knows is not something which is known by the interviewer, that's where the asymmetric information comes in. There may be, in effect, a kind of discrimination, which is not intended because you hate the members of that group. It's not that you hate Indians or the blacks or whatever it is, but you actually want to use the information that you have in an intelligent, expected utility maximizing way. That's the argument. Now, if that leads ultimately to racist results, which I think Phelps gives good reason to think it would and does, then it raises two types of questions. One is the one that you are raising, namely, would it be therefore morally right not to be rational, quote unquote, in using reasoning in this way? That's one question which I have to ask. The other question is, if you believe that people won't act like that, the interviewers will not, then do you need a systematic modification of that? And I believe the basic reasoning behind affirmative action relates as much to asymmetric information as it does to many of the most standard things. In fact, I think it is a stronger basis than correcting a historical wrong, which I think has always struck me as not a particularly good argument for affirmative action at all. But when it has this feature that given asymmetric information, what you will end up with is worse use of information than if you had full information, and particularly in the direction that discriminates against a certain group, then you have a case for affirmative action that counters that. And I want to bring that argument forward along with the moral argument. But that's all I can say today because I can't give the 5th lecture today.
Dr. Sen, what would you anticipate would be the sociological implications of the dwindling sex ratios of women vis-a-vis men? In history, we have mostly had the reverse, where we have more men than women, especially in periods following protracted wars and so on. So, what would you say would be the sociological implications?
You mean the increasing ratio of women in the world? Yeah. It's not, of course, recognized. We are not there yet. I've often seen statements saying there are more women than men in the world, and sometimes I've seen even in feminist literature, with which I'm myself quite associated as one of the founding editorial board members of the Journal of Feminist Economics, I've seen articles saying, since we, quote unquote, women are a majority in the world, but that's not the case. Women are about, the ratio of women to men in the world still is about 98 to 100, mainly because the bias which I was discussing in the other side and which you point out historically had existed throughout the world. I personally think that nothing much turns in terms of the social consequences on that. There are all kinds of peculiar modeling I've seen. You can't find brides or you can't find bridegrooms, and then something happens. It's like potatoes being in excess supply or in excess demand, and the prices change and etc. I don't think much happens, actually. That's not the way the whole game of getting together and mating proceeds. I think people put up with a great deal of quote-unquote mismatches in that respect. So I think nothing much would happen. I think if, as I expect, the ratio of women to men continue to rise, and it would probably get to about 105 women to men for the world as a whole, when these discriminatory influences disappear, I don't think anything much will happen. I mean, I think that's what will happen. I mean, people wonder, by the way, why the biological thing, how do you know it's biological as opposed to social? That's a big debate in which many people are involved. I think there's some evidence to indicate that women actually survive better than men for biological reasons. One particular evidence is the female fetuses have lower miscarriage rate than male fetuses do. Roughly about 109 female fetuses are conceived compared with 100 male fetuses. By the time they're, 109 male fetuses are conceived compared with 100 female fetuses. By the time they're born, about 105 male to female. And by the time they led their life, they're about opposite, 105 women to men, if there's no discrimination. And I think that pattern is well established. There could be some argument even in terms of selectional argument as to why even the higher survival at point of birth is partly connected, a higher ratio of men at time of birth is connected with a kind of, as an attempt at compensation in the Darwinian way. But I'm not a full-fledged Darwinian, so I'm not a creationist, I should explain, but I'm not full-fledged Darwinian in this respect. So I think we tend to imagine that all these will have very momentous consequences. This particular one I think would not. If I had time, which I'm not going to discuss, I think even the age problem is overemphasized in the world today, but I won't go into it because that would take me some time to ask why I'm less worried about the rise of the average age of the people in the world. I think you may have to. There are some people in the middle who are being missed out by the roving microphones.
You mentioned the interaction between different sources of discrimination. In India, I believe there is some evidence that the greatest opposition to women's empowerment in terms of political representation is coming from the parties which represent backward castes. Your comments?
Well, the evidence there is very mixed, by the way. We discussed that in the last book that Jean Drèze and I did, called India, Economic Development, Social Opportunity, and it figures again in a somewhat more extended form in the forthcoming book, that traditionally the so-called backward castes, or the lower caste generally, because backward is sometimes used as a technical term, has tended to have somewhat lower gender inequality, not as much lower as was often thought, but somewhat lower. And one of the things you find is a kind of catching up with the upper caste anti-female bias as there is a migration upwards. And insofar as that is the case, you might see a kind of reduction of gap, but it wouldn't explain what you are arguing, namely that the backward caste may actually have greater opposition. It won't be very hard to understand that if you relate it to the connection between class and gender, which I was arguing about, that what you're looking at, what may appear to be primarily backward caste, but if you redefine the identity in terms of economic categories, you're looking at relatively poorer rather than relatively affluent people. And insofar as, beginning with the prime ministerships of Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and so on, insofar as you see a tendency to go against that in the more affluent sections of the community, you might be catching a feature of anti-gender, anti-women, or gender bias, which is a reflection on the economic side rather than the caste side. I just don't know. But I do know this, on the basis of the information that I have seen, the picture is immensely complex on that. So I'm not even, again, I've been answering the question assuming that your generalization is right. I don't think it's fully a generalization. Now, the issue about reserving parliamentary seats, is that what you are thinking about? Now there, of course, the opposition has come from different groups, including the women's group itself. This is what is being discussed, is that there is a suggestion that a third of the Indian parliamentary membership be reserved for women. And this had been in the way that it had been reserved, originally reserved for the untouchable group, the scheduled caste. And what took the form is that there were some seats where only scheduled castes, in this case only women, will be able to stand for election. Anyone can vote. But these reserved seats had that feature. That opposition has come from many groups, including some groups which represent the backward class, you're right. But it's also come from women's groups. For example, a very influential group connected with the magazine, Manushi, which had been one of the first, Madhu Keshwar and so on, had been one of the first group agitating, have actually taken a somewhat different position on that, arguing that this is not a good way of dealing with the female representation issue. Rather, the suggestion has been, and that's one of the points that Manushi has tried to argue, Manushi means women, by the way, is to argue that it should proceed more in the form of persuading that the political parties must have a certain proportion of women among the candidates they choose, so that it's not that men are banned from it, but the parties has to act on that. And I see personally there's a lot of merit in that, in comparison with actually reserving the seats for women. But it's a big debate, and as you know, it's going on and gone on for about 5 years. So we'll see how it goes.
Do you have any views on the philosophical contradiction between, for example, being in favor of women's rights in the matter of abortion and yet not accepting the right to abort female fetuses selectively, especially if we can't use the practical argument of social consequences, which you seem to feel are probably not an important reason? How would you resolve the arguments in favor of one and not the other?
Well, I think there is an interesting philosophical issue involved in that, definitely. And it's not, I think the two things to recognize here is that neither of these arguments, you have correctly identified my position as being, in general, in favor of allowing abortion, and in general against sex-selective abortion. But let me begin by saying that neither of these are, I take it, an unproblematic position. I think the position in favor of abortion is not a gung-ho position. It's a dreadful thing to happen in many ways, and yet, considering everything and bearing in mind that there is a distinction between a person and a fetus, it's not the same thing as other kinds of, murder or whatever it is. But it's not, it doesn't go through like a, oh, here it is, doesn't matter, it's very simple, it's just a fetus. Not like that. Similarly, the other side, after all, if there's a strong family preference for one kind or another, how would you, prima facie, there is a liberty-based argument in going that direction. So I think the first thing to do is to recognize the counter-argument exists in both cases. It's a question of how the balance of argument proceeds in each case. I think the balance of argument really turns in the gender case on the idea that systematic discrimination against any group is a morally unacceptable feature of a society. And there, the fact that a person is not yet born and may not even be a person does not modify the argument, because it is still a systematic discrimination against people who, against fetuses, which will then, in the fullness of time, become women. So I think basically one has to see, and that doesn't really fully answer the question, see that even though it's not the group-based consequences that I'm looking at, it is more the group-based ideas of discrimination, no matter what the consequences are, that no group should be singled out or separated out from other groups for discriminatory treatment. That's what really comes in. And it has so in some ways, even both these have oddly enough, a kind of libertarian flavor on both sides in a very different way. The abortion issue on ground that if you don't regard the fetus to be basically a person, then really the question about the liberty and that the agency of decision about that should be the mother isn't an argument that people like Judy Thompson and others have outlined in very great detail, taking counter arguments into account. But the second one turns on the libertarian premise, rather like the Robert Nozick's argument that there are many issues where what you are looking at is not the ultimate consequences at all. I think he overstates the case, but that's it's a position that he had made, and I think it's a very important position to make clear, and he has made it clear to all of us in a way that wasn't earlier, was to say that many cases just the fact of discriminatory treatment would be in itself bad. Now, in the Nozickian system, of course, discrimination of any kind would be unacceptable. Now the question is, would it apply in this case to the gender thing, and could it be seen that a discrimination against the fetus, even though the fetus is not a girl to be born yet, but once born, it is actually acting, preventing that girl from developing and becoming that fetus from becoming a girl and being born, whether there is a similar argument, no matter what the consequence is on the gender ratio. I think that's the direction I would tend to go. So in some ways there would be both, as it were, kind of left libertarian argument, but they are libertarian rather than basically consequentialist argument. They're consequentialist in a very broad sense, but not in the standard way in which, say, utilitarians would tend to be consequentialist. So that's the direction I'd go. But, this is really a subject for a long essay rather than a rapid-fire answer. So, short answer is, I don't think there is a contradiction, but it has to be clear why there isn't a contradiction.
Good evening, Dr. Sen. I have a question, and I may wish to ask a follow-up if it doesn't come out exactly the way I would like it to. Assuming that reason itself is an epistemologically valid way of addressing issues of discrimination and racism. Reason itself. Yes. Is an epistemologically way or method of addressing issues of discrimination. What do you say then to the Einstein from the traditionally marginalized group who has an independent identity, not one that's dependently dialectical, dependent on how the third person views him or her, but is independent, bereft of reliance on what other people think of the person? How do you address that Einstein who yet is still discriminated against and still is left out of equal opportunities for advancement and career achievement?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I think a couple of things. First, the part of the question is addressing an issue which I think is easier to deal with than the other. And in fact, both parts relate to the last 2 points I just flagged, namely the Phelps-related query. I'm not going to take the same answer as Phelps or Bill Gummy exactly, but they're closely linked with the question, the analysis. So the part of it which is easy to deal with is the Phelps part, which it says, well, if the Einsteins of that community end up being discriminated because of rational, the Bayesian rational reasoning, expected utility reasoning, and if you are not, as somebody asked the question, the first question was on moral, if you cannot do the moral reform, then, and here I'm going beyond Phelps to say, then you do need a legal structure which counteracts that influence, which makes it impossible. Now, that, of course, to a great extent is done by insisting on various types of informational scrutiny, demanding more information be looked at, and so on. But partly also it may take the form of some kind of affirmative action within in a group in which, with might, and we may have to discuss some alternatives, which would bring the Einsteins come out more clearly, despite a system that is informationally stacked against such people. So that is a kind of institutional thing. I think there are problems on how to deal with it, but there's no great dilemma there, I think. The other issue is when the first person identity comes. There is this Einstein in this group, and he says, look, I identify myself not with this group at all, but with the fellow Einsteins of the world. I don't know how many there are, but there must be some, and I'm one of them. And that is a bigger problem for me, because I've been arguing right from the first lecture, I don't know whether you're present in the first two, that we can define our identity as we like. And we have a, well, not as we like, but we have a choice. If we don't discover it, we have to take a deliberative decision on it. We need reason, and you began with reason, that reason has a part to play, and I could give a reason for belonging to one group rather than another. And if you really have a freedom, it's somewhat similar to the tension that Professor Alakabasu was drawing attention to, namely that in this case there may be a tension. Somebody might abandon their group. You know, they may be declassed individuals, as it were. And we might think that there's something wrong, that even though this person comes from a privileged background, very underprivileged background, because he or she happens to be herself in a lucky position of having some asset which takes him or her out of that group, then she simply abandons that group and doesn't think about it, because now she chooses to identify herself with a different category, not the underprivileged category. That raises the ethical question quite deeply as to how we should think about it. Now, it's a class of problems of which Beltrami's is one, namely that if people tend to define their identity reactively against, say, a dominant identity, against, you know, I'm a Muslim, quote unquote, against a Christian Western world, or I'm an Asian against a European-dominated world, etc. The question is whether there is an argument for saying that that's not a right way of thinking about it. There are other identities which are important, and a reactive identity is not that's Beltrami's argument. It fails. There is a failure of self-knowledge there, because you're always defining yourself as the other. Similarly, in this case, you are defining yourself in a category that you have devised, and it happened to be convenient for you, because you can forget about all these other people who are in this underprivileged mess in which they are in. The issue there has to be whether, in terms of either self-knowledge epistemology or your moral responsibility, whether you're failing by redefining yourself in that. Now, this is extending your question beyond the way you stated it. I think that is an interesting issue, and I do intend to discuss that. The only modification I would do is it's not a question of being independent, because I think all the categories would somehow be relevant to each other, and we live in an interdependent world, but not being parasitic on a particular identity. That's what the issue really is. I think even in the Beltrami case, I would argue that there's no way you can take the reactive identity out. The fact of, if Western dominance is very involved and very important in the world today, then the fact that you don't belong to that category, and that in terms of privilege and underprivilege, you don't belong to that category, that remains a relevant part of your identity, and your self-knowledge cannot be insular to the dialectical form. And yet, you don't want to be parasitic, and I would like to interpret or extend the Beltrami argument by saying that it's an anti-parasitism argument rather than an anti-dialectical argument. But I'm really getting more into my fifth lecture than I should at this time.
Hi, this has to do with this example you cited regarding the victims in riots, that the thugs on each side kill a very poor working class, essentially working class people from the other side, Hindu Muslim for instance. But the thugs themselves could very well be members of the same class. My question is, can we then assume that in that kind of a situation, the class identity is being superseded by the communal or religious identity? Which
well, it's not superseded. It's, you know, it's a variety of things. The riots have very peculiar pattern, really. I was great misfortune of seeing them around me when I was a small boy and reflective on these matters. Yes, the communal identity is suddenly overwhelmed. That was the point I made in my first lecture, that it has the effect of completely overwhelming other identities. But then, if you bring in the class, there are peculiar things too, that there are quite often some of the Hindu-Muslim riots, the financing came from business groups. You paid rewards to murderers in your community who murdered or claimed to have murdered people on the other side. Now there, of course, the rational calculation comes in. I mean, who can you murder most easily than somebody living in a slum? You go into a slum, you kill 23 at one go. You go into a house, you have to fight a real problem, you know, with a whole lot of rather privileged people, and then you end up killing, alas, only 2. And don't get very much reward. So to some extent, it's also driven by the way these riots were carried out. Now, sometimes the rewards are financial, of which there is considerable evidence in the 1940s in pre-partition India. Sometimes it's politically organized, as we now know more and more about what happened in the Hutu-Tutsi rivalry and the killing of the Tutsis by Hutus, how it was organized. Now, in all these, it's partly a matter of identity, the way persons are defining, partly also the social organization which operates in the direction of genocide. And it's a combination. But there is an element of what you say, that the religious identity, communal identity, I wouldn't even say religious, the communal identity is swamping other kinds of identities. And there, of course, the fact that the identity of the victimized groups are exactly the same in terms of class background is a very important point to make politically. It's part of the argument, part of the rhetoric that has an anti-violence implication. It's redefining identity. It's very important. Not redefining, but pointing out that there exists a more manifest identity, that you're basically killing people who belong to a group, and possibly even a very similar group to yourself.
I'd like to ask a somewhat philosophical question about the category of class. In a way, there's a distinction that I think that you're drawing on between class as a kind of condition.
As what?
As a condition that people are in, and class as an identity that people, you know, in a first-person way, take on. Because people could fail to have an identity as the member of a class, but nevertheless, their class position could actually be driving a lot of what they do, and they might understand what they do in terms of communal loyalties, but if we look at the larger picture, it might turn out that these people, that it's because their class condition that they express themselves in terms of communal violence, but that they don't fully recognize this. So I guess I was thinking about class as a type of category in terms of your panorama of communal, race, caste, gender, and I might be missing one, but there's a sense in which the other identities are sort of ascriptive identities that you can't get out of. But class as a situation is something which, you know, if a person at some point has no wealth and power, and then at another point they do have wealth and power, they no longer have the same class, you know, situation that they had before. But for gender, race, caste, and communal identity, one can't opt out in that same way.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think I agree with the observation that you make. It's not a question, of course, but I agree what you're saying, that I think there's a real difference between the ascription of identity and the, as it were, the perception of identity seen within oneself. And you're also right that sometimes it could be the case that your behavior pattern is being driven by an identity of which you are not exactly aware. That could happen. You could also have the opposite problem, which is the old classic problem of Marxian false consciousness, where actually you have, you end up acting in a way that, you know, not in favor of your class or whatever it is, but in some other way because you don't identify yourself, don't see clearly, you know, through the fog of objective illusion, as the theory went, that you actually belong to that caste. It generates the impression that you don't belong to that caste. This is actually quite important. I mean, one of the things in the Indian politics which is very important is that the lower classes, quote unquote, one doesn't never use the word in India, but because it's thought to be, the Indian language is much purer than practice. So it has the feature of never using lower classes, but keeping the reality there. But if you take the lower classes, I think they're divided into these various groups, quite often intercaste or intercommunity rivalries coming into the story. Not so much in the Muslim, but within the majority community primarily. And that has the feature of really making the perception of class and the fact that you have a commonality of interest undermined. I think that is, I personally think that the theory of false consciousness has a great bearing in understanding class situation as well as gender situation. Quite often it happens by suppressing, you know, this idea that, you know, there's, I mean, I don't feel, quote unquote, that gender is a correct discrimination, distinction. I'm really concerned with the family. That's the kind of rhetoric you often get. And it could be argued that by talking in rather grand terms of family's interests and never putting forward the interests of yourself as a woman, you're actually probably missing out of a substantial category of deprived people, namely women in this world. That sort of classic Marxian category which, of false consciousness, which I think has relevant. There are two ways of using this thing. There's Akhil Bilgami has another paper, later paper called Identity and Identification, which he goes into it. I slightly disagree there with him, but he was pointing out that typically the Marxian false consciousness has been used as a kind of conflict between an objective, it's very similar to what you were saying, objective way of describing people and, you know, and self-perception. And the argument has been that if your self-perception doesn't fit what objectively has been described, then, you know, you have false consciousness. And Akhil rightly points out that that's not shown that it's false in any sense, because it is a categorization that you happen to take, but not the one which somebody else is ascribing to you. I thought the Marxian point, or at least, you know, it's an obscurely made point, but insofar as one can make it, wasn't so much that it has to correspond to some externally described classification, but that you need to critically ask the question, who am I? That's the issue. And if somebody had never asked that question, simply never taken the fact that women are deprived and there happen to be a woman, and therefore that is an, you have to ask, should I attach any importance to that? Similarly, I belong to the, you know, the working classes, deprived, unemployed, you know, precariously living, but don't attach any importance to it. I thought that the basic question that's being asked is, should I not pose that question? No. It remains open. Even after that, you would say, I've thought about it, I've critically looked at it, I'm not going to attach any importance to it. I think a person would not be then accused, in my judgment, of being suffering from false consciousness. It's a methodological point that you're failing to a critical exercise. It's not a substantive point that you have to correspond to some externally given identification. That's the direction I would make the distinction, but I think it's a very rich line of analysis that you presented, with which I agree. Okay.
In view of the...
Are you going to use microphone or not? You probably don't need it, but...
Oh, sorry. Sir, in view of the widespread gender bias, an enormous number of peticides, female peticides around the globe, do you think that an international ban on predetermination of sex for a child should be enacted by the United Nations?
You know, these are very difficult questions for reasons that Professor Alakabasu raised earlier. And, you know, I think there's a kind of forum in which it's very important to arrive at a position, like a United Nations discussion. I don't think the really interesting thing for a lecture series like this is what position I recommend, because, you know, I'm not chairman of a committee that's going to report to the Secretary General to do something on that. It's mainly a question of bringing out what the considerations are that one has to look at in order to begin to, you know, in order to think clearly about that. And the feticide issue, of course, relates to the question on one side, as Professor Basu pointed out, to the liberty of women to do things to their body on which others should not override. That's the kind of argument that exists. There's also the kind of question about what effect it has on long-run thing. That's what I overlooked, you know, what I didn't emphasize very much, namely what would happen if there was gender asymmetry in terms of birth. Then there's also the intermediate point, which I did emphasize, namely what it does in terms of discrimination on people who will be born but who are not yet born. I mean, that's quite natural for us. We don't say, don't worry about the environment. How can you worry about the environment? These people are not there. That's long run. We could still say we could be discriminating against them if we fill up the world with, you know, if we thin the ozone layer and so on. The fact that they're not yet born does not mean that we are not doing any harm to them, which an argument from liberty cannot actually take note of. So I think there are these complex considerations that go in that direction. International ban, I just don't know. I mean, I'm not a great believer in international bans anyway. But would I have voted in India if I were a member of parliament for the banning of sex determination? Yes, I think I would have, because on balance, I think that's the way the weight of argument proceeds. But it's not one where there are no counter-arguments on the other side.
Hello. You said that in India they had some quotas for the outcast in order to...
They what?
They had some quotas...
Yeah, you know, you have to hold this close to your mouth.
You said that in India they used to have some quotas for the outcasts in order to help them socially develop and level the differences between the majority of people and their minority. But that thing that just helped the elite of the outcast. Do you think that that kind of system or reserving quotas is a reasonable or viable way to tackle inequalities, or is just meaningless because it helps with, it gets out with unwanted results?
Well, I think if I'm not sure I absolutely followed you, but let me see. If you think that I'm going in a completely different direction, then you say that you're answering a different question. If your point is that taking into account the difficulty that the economically advantaged, but members of socially disadvantaged groups may benefit from it, are they on balance good thing to have or not?
Yeah, would you say if you were in the Indian parliament, would you put on a law to set some places in the parliament for outcasts or women, or you wouldn't?
Actually, I'm not in favor of putting any position in parliament for reasons that I discussed. My position is not different from that of Manushi, the feminist group, which is opposed to it but want to do it differently. But your question is more general than that. We don't have to, the reason is, I think, representation of the people in parliament in a democracy cannot really be legitimately a matter of reservation, ultimately. And I think in India, they did for 15 years, I think, or somewhat longer than that, had the scheduled castes or the ex-untouchables represented, and there was some social function they played, but I think it's very problematic then and problematic today. But I think your question is more general than that. Your question is that if there's some benefit from this, but not really as much benefit as you'd expect, then should you have it? So I think we have to be sure that there is some benefit. I think there is some benefit. On balance, I think the reservation has had the effect of bringing in people from categories who would not have been there at all. Now, of course, this relates to the question that was asked earlier. If they remain somehow loyal to their underprivileged background, then of course you could expect to see a type of impact in the administration of the country that the civil service intermingling of castes bring about. It's also the case that when you're distributing justice, and quite often the civil servant act as magistrates and so on, if you actually belong to if all the magistrates come from a group of which they have no experience at all of being discriminated in any way, then I think they don't have enough variety of experiences. The argument for jury trial, getting your peers there, applies to intermingling of position where the magistrates play the jury role, which is ultimately also an argument for the mixing in this case. I think on balance it serves a purpose. I don't think I would be in favor of abolishing it without anything else coming in, not with Parliament, but with civil service. But I would at the same time, and by the way, the evidence that this has reduced the efficiency of civil service, it hasn't really worked. By and large, the southern states introduced that much earlier than northern and have not, on the whole, had worse performance, if anything, better administration. I don't think better for that reason, but no evidence that it's been worse for that reason. But my complaint is that you could do better than that, because just as social disadvantage is a disadvantage, economic disadvantage is too, and they couple. And if you could have a system which in some ways provide better incentive and the better opportunities for economically disadvantaged people, then I think that would be worth doing along with the social representation that you're doing. So my claims are, A, it may be good, but not very good. You should not make best the enemy of the good. That's the first point. The second point is that if it's good but not very good, well, can't you make it somewhat better? And we have to think of ways and means of doing it. And this kind of analysis, one hopes, helps to pose the question on the basis of which bettering of the system might proceed. That's the ambition.
Is there a further question? Yeah, so one last.
Yeah. Excuse me, Dr. Sen, just one last question.
Sure.
I know you're going to be presenting at a later date more about your views of identity, but one in particular is quite important. I just wanted to get back to this issue of reactive identities and ask you if you think that reactive identities apply to the advantaged community as well as the disadvantaged community, meaning aren't those who are advantaged dependent, and don't they react also in part to the identities of those who are disadvantaged, and they set themselves apart saying, well, I am advantaged because I am not disadvantaged. So their identities in part are based on the fact that in some way that they define for themselves, they are better than or more advantaged than other people, number one. And then number two, how should the Einsteins of these marginalized groups go about their life business? Should they continue to strive for a Du Boisian acceptance of their double consciousness, or should they give in and accept a more advantaged consciousness and alienate the groups from which they come?
Now, very difficult question. As far as the second is concerned, I'm not going to discuss it because that's really the subject of the future of identity in the last thing. Brief answer is the former than the latter, the Du Boisian, as you were calling it. I think the need, I think that we have to marshal the multiplicity of our identities for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons is that depending on the context, the weight that we want to attach to our distinct identities would vary. You won't be able to get a preeminent canonical identity which is going to swamp everything else for every kind of question. That's the direction I'll have to go, but that I don't want to pursue further now. As far as the former is concerned, you're absolutely right, that quite often the reactive one is a privileged reaction. It can take the form, of course, I mean, one of the standard rhetoric in any kind of discrimination has been that these people act in a peculiar way and we are different from them. We found, with the Nobel, I'd started a trust called Patichi Trust, one in Bangladesh, one in India. And we carried out some surveys in schools in West Bengal. And the general pattern is quite depressing, but one of them is that there's quite a lot of neglect on the part of the teachers, often supported by the union, by the way, of not showing up in school, not teaching, not appearing. And if you're dealing with schools where most of the children come from very underprivileged, socially as well as economically categories, landless laborers, very low cost, the absenteeism is much greater. And when you talk actually with the teachers, who actually are now very much better paid than they were, I mean, as a student, as an undergraduate in Calcutta, I remember going out and demonstrations in favor of teachers' salaries because they were an exploited group. Now they are among the more privileged group, actually, and in a completely different class from the students, from the pupils from backward groups. But one of the things you heard is a description about, well, they're not really interested, these groups, they're not interested in education. You find, however, absolutely no evidence. Every time you talk with the parents are extraordinarily keen. And even in one case, they even said, well, you know, they have very peculiar eating habits. They eat snakes and snails and so on. I did try to point out that the French do too. But there was a way of undermining them, saying that they're not really basically fit for education. That's a reactive identity too. Now, the point I wanted to make is that when what Akhil Belgrami's issue was, I mean, that kind of reactive identity is very easy to reject because it's nasty and racist and it's terrible in many ways. Akhil Belgrami's point is in a much more serious case, when it's the underdogs who have the reactive identity. And his point really is that you're still losing a sense of self, by defining yourself as the other. Who are you? I'm not Western, I'm a Muslim. Rather than I'm a Muslim and these are the characteristics, doesn't matter what the West is. That's our tradition, that's our heritage, etc. That's the way that he is seeing it. And what I have to discuss in the fifth lecture is to what extent as a part of a fuller epistemology, the reactive thing has to continue to remain because that is part of the manifest reality of the world in which we live. Now, some people like post-colonial literature and so on tend to make us almost parasitic on that one identity. That one might protest. And yet, not to be parasitic doesn't mean that it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean, not that either. I'd add a third observation to it, that there are some cases when the group that do a reactive identity are neither uniformly more privileged nor uniformly less privileged. A very good example is the whole debate about Asian values. That is, the argument was, the West, to a great extent it was the reaction. The West is a great depository of science and technology, modernity, democracy, liberty, tolerance. Now, as I tried to discuss in the first 2 lectures, most of these claims are wrong. That is, in terms of the history of liberty and tolerance in the world, you do not see that kind of a pattern. But one of the features that the reactive identity took was to say, of course, that is the West. We don't. Here in Asia, we don't attach importance to tolerance. We don't attach importance to democracy. We're different. Of course we're different. We're not Western, and proud of that too. Now, the interesting feature is, first of all, of course, there is a complete epistemological confusion about the history of China, of India, of Arabia, and so on, but Japan. On top of that, there is also a kind of reactiveness here, that you say that, all right, we are like that, but we don't like your system anyway. We don't never like democracy, never like tolerance, etc. So that becomes then a big flag-carrying position. And who carries the flag? It really comes usually from quite privileged people. Lee Kuan Yew, who would be a great theorist, by the way, a great leader. I've been very critical of him. I have to also acknowledge a truly outstanding leader. Similarly, a great many people who have championed Asian values are, among the leaders of the community coming there, privileged, quite often much richer than most people in the West anyway, but nevertheless carrying the strong Asian identity. So it doesn't fall in either of those 2 categories, but what I'm saying is that that distinction may have to be modified by taking these cases who are contingently deprived as being treated, quote unquote, as Asian, not as good as the West, and yet contingently also privileged, being often richer than the West, and quite often extremely privileged in that community. So it's really quite a rich subject area that you and I are talking about.
We are out of time. Please join us at the reception just through the doors, and many thanks.